Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Lee and I have the pleasure of being the ReserveBar host for this virtual tasting. ReserveBar is an online destination for fine spirits, wine, and champagne where you can explore a growing library of over 5,000 bottles to find exactly what you're looking for. We also offer a great selection of glassware and barware and even offer custom engraving on select bottles just in case you need some ideas for the holidays. It's our pleasure to work with incredible brands like Glen Grant to produce these virtual tastings to give an opportunity for you to learn from industry experts, brand ambassadors, and bartenders from around the world. And for today, if you haven't had the chance to pick up your favorite Glen Grant release, or you find some new inspiration through this conversation we're about to have, you can go to reservebar.com and use the offer code Glen Grant VIP to receive free shipping on your Glen Grant purchase. So now I'll turn it over to Glen Grant Global Brand Ambassador, Robin Coupar, and Campari Academy's Jessamine McClellan.
Thanks for that great introduction. I love the holidays, especially for gifting. I've been working in the whiskey industry for almost 7 or 8 years now, and this is the time of year when everybody is super excited to get a bottle sent to them, or you show up at someone's house. And I know times are strange and weird, but I love the fact that ReserveBar, you can ship it directly to them, so you don't even have to see them, but you can still say thank you. So I'm super excited to chat with you guys today about Glen Grant. We are going to have a wonderful, informative conversation all about single malt Scotch, and I'm here really to just be the ringleader and moderator. I will be answering your chat questions. If you want to go ahead and pop them up in the Q&A, I'll just be keeping an eye on those. But without further ado, I will hand this over to Robin Coupar, the Global Brand Ambassador for Glen Grant, and he will take us away on a single malt Scotch journey.
Thank you very much, Lee and Jessamine. I'm going to just start the proceedings with a little drop of the 12 years old. Jessamine, do you have a little drop of the, well, we all have one, don't we? Now, you may or may not have some of this, but it's definitely a single malt Scotch whiskey you may want to consider adding to your recipe. This is the 12 years old. You can see it's got a nice sort of golden color. It's aged in a combination of ex-bourbon and ex-sherry barrels. It's bottled at 86 proof and it's aged 12 years. So that's 12 years maturation. So typically when we start these, what we call master classes, we start to just appreciate, the liquid in its own right before we sort of launch into the story. So Jessamine, take it away. I mean, you do a lot of these nosing and tastings in whiskey, but how would you evaluate the 12 years old? And Leah,
well, first, I guess I would just say, in case any of you that are with us today are not necessarily super experienced drinkers, typically, Robin and I both have tulip-shaped glasses. Lee, I can't actually think you have I think you have a Glencairn too, don't you? What's your glass? Show me your glass.
Rocks.
I know you got a rocks glass. Okay, cool.
I do have a rocks
There's
glass.
lots of different types of glasses that you can drink whiskey in, but typically we like to drink, especially if you're drinking something neat, in a tulip-style glass. And then also when you're nosing something, you want to keep your mouth slightly open so that you can really kind of take in the vapors. And for me, with the 12-year, I get a lot of this really beautiful honey note to it that's really coming from the casking. But there's this fruitiness to it, almost like apples, or pear drop is another kind of like pear candy. Those are the things that really I pick up quite a lot, but just like a little hint of spice too. Maybe a little baking spice, like an allspice. That's my, in a nutshell, what I'm getting here.
Well, and also this is a single malt Scotch. So it's made from 3 ingredients: barley, which is malted, water, and yeast. So we'll talk a little bit about how we make the whiskey. So what I think I'll start with, I'm going to share a presentation, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, let me fix that for you.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a presentation with you and really take you through the story of Glen Grant. Because what's the beauty about these malt whiskies is that there are many distilleries in Scotland, and they've all got their own unique characteristics. They have their unique story, their unique history. And also they also have their unique sort of production story, etc. So
Go ahead and try again now. Sorry, Robin, you should be able to do it.
all right.
Anytime I'm going to drink this now because I've just been talking. For those of you joining us, what are you drinking?
Jessamine, as you talked about that, I can absolutely pull out the sweetness, that honey nose to it. And I couldn't pull out that flavor when you talked about like fruit, like a pear. Instantly, I was like, yes, that's exactly what I was thinking, but I couldn't pull it out.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely a lot of fruity notes.
Yeah, what I was going to say is about that particular kind of orchard fruit note, like apples and pears, or it's like that's very characteristic of a Speyside malt style. So Glen Grant, you can think of as being like a hallmark Speyside malt. It's really beautiful, fruity, floral, sweet, elegant, and much lighter in both body, but also in those kind of fruity notes than other single malts out there that might be a little bit more on the pungent side. Robin's really going to kind of like dig into the like technical reasons of why that distillate tastes the way that it does. But for now, we'll just talk about deliciousness.
Sorry, can you see my screen?
We can. It's the artisanal team one. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Go for it.
So what I just want to show you the new pack in all its glory. So what we're sampling from is the old bottle. So right now we're in transition into the new pack. So you'll start to see this more and more. But you know, it's Asian bourbon and sherry. It's bottled at 43%, and we've already talked about the tasty notes. So really, a little bit of the geography. You know, Scotland is the top of the British Isles. It's a very sort of windswept, you know, rocky outcrop. It's a very old country. I mean, we're on top of lots of layers of rock, and I think it's important to know, you know, that Scotland makes more than half of the world's whiskey. And so it's truly a global category. And that's, I'm talking about, you know, the sum of Scotch whiskey, Canadian whiskey, American whiskey, Indian whiskey, Japanese whiskey. So it's really one of the, you know, Scotland's gift to the world. Many people used to flock and still do flock to Scotland for the game of golf. And for example, St. Andrews, many Americans will go there, you know, just to go back home and tell people that they played at St. Andrews. But St. Andrews is, you know, very famous. It's the home of golf. You know, it's an old country. I mean, if you go back, you know, a couple of hundred years, people were living in castles. It's a highly fortified country, you know, the clan system, etc. Always in sort of conflict with its southern neighbors. So if you go back in time, it was a bit like the Game of Thrones, really. That's Edinburgh Castle there. And, you know, we have you know, Celtic culture. You know, we encourage young kids to dance on swords. We play the bagpipes. We've just lost one of our greatest sons, Sir Sean Connery, who passed away only about a week ago, which was a huge loss, and we're still in mourning. He was Scotland's, you know, greatest living son until about a week ago. But we still have Rod Stewart. But I think what people know about Scotland across the world is our whiskey. And even the history behind whiskey is quite interesting. You know, the name for whiskey comes from the Gaelic Whisca Behar, the water of life. And of course, in Latin, it's aqua vitae, and French is eau de vie. So you would have monks that went from the Isles all the way to the Middle East, and they would learn from the Arabian alchemists who were making alcohol through alembics. So the Arabs really were the first distillers. So the monks that, you know, went to the Middle East to learn about the Holy Scriptures would learn from the Arabs how to distill. They would go back to Ireland and Scotland, and they would distill themselves. Of course, when you distill and you make alcohol and you imbibe it, you know, you get a little bit tipsy, possibly if you drink too much, but I think we've all been there. We're all over 21. But the monks would drink and it would make them feel closer to God. And they would be buying their grain from the farmers. And in time, the farmers realized that they could make whiskey too, because they were buying it back from the monks. And then you see whiskey goes viral in Scotland. So this is a map of Scotland really highlighting the 5 distilling regions. So you have Campbelltown, which there at the bottom, Campbelltown was very successful distillery or distilling producing region up until Prohibition in America, where many of the distilleries went bankrupt. You have the island of Islay that makes the smoky whiskies. You have the lowlands where, you know, they were making a lighter style, quite often a triple distilled whiskey. You had a lot of the Irish immigrants coming in during the Industrial Revolution. Then you have the Highland region, which probably has the biggest diversity of different styles of whiskey. And then you have the sort of beating heart of Scotland's Speyside. And many of the, you know, the well-known names in distilling are based in Speyside. So Macallan, in fact, Macallan is just down the road from us. Glenlivet, which is the biggest single malt brand in America. You also have Glenfiddich, Dalmore, Aberlour, Benriach, Benrinnes. I mean, this list goes on and on. So roughly up to about 50% of malt whiskey production is in Speyside. So, you know, what attracts people, I think, to malt whiskey is not just the actual whiskey itself and the variety of whiskey. It's a lot of the stories, these wonderful stories. And our distillery was established in 1840 by 2 brothers, John and James Grant. And so James Grant was, that's his picture on the right. They had taken advantage of the 1823 Excise Act. Government legalizes the production of whiskey. So they already own Aberlour, Aberlour Distillery, which is just down the road. And they start building Glen Grant Distillery in 1839. It gets its license actually in 1840. So one of the brothers is making the whiskey. The other brother is investing into the railroads. So the Grant family, this Grant family really developed the railroads in Speyside, which opened up the Speyside distilling community, really. It allowed, you know, other distilleries to use that infrastructure and start to establish themselves too. And then you have a few years later, 1872, so about 32 years later, the keys are handed over to the son of James, who's also known as James. And by the way, Grant's a very well-known name in that part of Scotland. There's many, many Grants come from Speyside. The Grant clan was a very powerful clan. And so James Grant comes in and he's only about 24 years old. He inherits the distillery, he's got the keys, and he starts to change things. He's known as the Major because he serves time in the army. But he's sort of a bit of a revolutionizer or revolutionary in the Scotch whiskey world at the time. I mean, he's the first man to own a motor car. If you're into vintage cars, that's a Model 1 Rolls Royce. He's exporting his whiskey across the world. This is in India, where he's on a safari. In fact, in India and Bombay, Glen Grant is sold for medicinal purposes. Here he is a little bit closer to home in Scotland. This is a curling match. So some of you who are in the East Coast, where it's very, very cold, curling has become quite popular. But it's a Scottish game where it involves sliding these big stones on ice. It's a little bit like bowling on ice. And you can see him here networking, hobnobbing with the sort of great and the good, you know. And meanwhile, I think that's his driver there in the bottom right of the picture below. He's pouring drams of Glen Grant, really greasing the wheels. He's a great networker, Major James Grant. But what's happening across the British Isles at the time is quite interesting, because when you go down to London, which is the big sort of population down in England, you know, the middle and upper classes are not drinking Scotch whiskey. They're actually drinking cognac. And cognac, of course, those of you who are into wine, you may have heard of the phylloxera epidemic or pandemic that swept across France. So most of the wine and cognac that was consumed in England came from France. And a tiny aphid called phylloxera completely wiped out up to about 90% of France's grape harvests. So suddenly, literally overnight, the cognac supplies dried out. So this gave a great opportunity to, the blenders. Lots of men called John Jameson, John Dewar, Johnny Walker. They all started blending grain whiskey with malt whiskey, putting a label on it, and marketing to this big sort of wealthy market. It was basically the first time Scotch whiskey really sort of broke across the Scottish border into the south and really made its mark. So while the phylloxera was the great villain and destroyed France, and actually it was a great hero for the Scotch whiskey industry, and indeed the Napa, California, South America wine industry, because many of these vines were sort of saved and shipped across the high seas to start new wineries in the New World. So this little man, who Major James Grant, the son, he was about 5'1", short in stature, but quite a proud man. And of course, this is the age of the Victorian age, where engineering is very, very important. So he designs these tall stills and purifies, because he doesn't want to adulterate his malt whiskey with that cheaper, blander grain whiskey. And that's what everybody else was getting into. But he thought, well, I'm going to persevere, and I'm going to create a distillation process which really delivers a lighter, more sophisticated, elegant, more refined style, but it's going to be 100% a single malt. So you could say that Glen Grant was the first single malt to really be marketed. In fact, there are some brochures back in the days in the 1880s, which actually describe the process of distillation. Okay, so the next offering that we have in the US market is the 15 years old. And we decided to launch the 15 years old into the US market, because we knew in America that the US is really the home of Scotch whiskey. The American market really embraced Scotch whiskey, during Prohibition, after World War II, and ever since, Scotch whiskey has really, grown and grown and grown. So we look at the US as really being the home of Scotch whiskey. And with that, you get a lot of experts in America. There's lots of great destination, places where you can buy Scotch, great bars that you can drink Scotch whiskey all across from the East Coast to the West Coast. The Americans really embrace Scotch whiskey. And now today, the US is our biggest market for single malt Scotch whiskey. So roughly about 2 and a bit million cases. But what's great about this category is that it's so broad, there's something for everyone to try. So we launched the 15 years old because we wanted something that would be quite, big, quite voluptuous, high in, flavor, something that would really deliver a great whiskey drinking experience. And this is what it is, the 15 years old. So it's bottled at batch strength at 100 proof or 50% ABV. So already you're going to get a little bit more whiskey in the bottle. And it's aged in first fill ex-bourbon barrels. So unlike the 12, which is bourbon and ex-sherry, this is 100% first fill ex-bourbon. So you think about, Kentucky, they remove the bourbon, the straight bourbon, that empty barrel is literally rolled onto a container, shipped across the high seas where it's filled in Scotland. And the other thing about this is that it's first fill ex-bourbon barrels. So it's not second fill, it's first fill. That's where we get the maximum delivery of flavor, the maximum intensity on the spirit as it ages. And finally, we bottle this non-chill filtered. So this is the current bottle. Now you'll notice the color is still quite pale to the 12 years old. And really that's tells you that, ex-bourbon is the maturation barrel. But the difference between the 15 years old, which is one of the sort of hidden gems, as it were, is it's much more fruitier. And when you taste it, it's really going to deliver a much greater mouthfeel. It's going to be much more viscous, chewier, more syrupy, and it's going to have much more of an intense nose. And it's a little, I describe it as a little bit sort of, I put multi-layered there. Tiramisu, the classic Italian dessert. You know, it's cream, banana, a bit of caramel. And then you get into those rich sort of spongy fruits, those red fruits. And at the end there, you might just get a little bit of twist of spice. Do you get that, Jessamine? How would you build on that?
I would say the spice is definitely contributing to it. I think primarily for me, it's because of that real like concentration of flavor comparatively to the other Glen Grant expressions. The 15-year is the one with the most bite to it. And I mean bite in a completely positive way, just that it has like an assertiveness about it.
Yes.
Definitely.
No, absolutely. It's a good point. I mean, this is, we look at the 15 years old as being one of those hidden gems for those sort of whiskey, let's say, experts who are kind of getting into whiskey and they want to buy something that's just a little bit different, a little bit, you know, more of those, what we call the sort of, what I call the sort of bells and whistles. So that non-chill filtration, that slightly different mouth style, that greater intensity. Because really what we have here is a highly complex product, really. And, you know, the craftsmanship that goes into it. And that, in fact, that's what we're going to talk about, the process on how we make Glen Grant, because every distillery is quite different. You know, there are different traditions, different, you know, philosophies really behind making a malt whiskey. So I'm going to take you through some of those processes that are unique to Glen Grant. Well, let's start with Scotland. Rains an awful lot in Scotland. You know, 99% of the population of Scotland complain bitterly that it rains all the time. They're always complaining about the weather in Scotland. But the distilling community, we actually pray for rain. So when we have a dry summer, we start to get nervous because we need water to make whiskey. So water, barley, and yeast are the three ingredients.
Robin, my dad went to University of Edinburgh, and he always used to say, if you don't like the weather in Scotland, wait 5 minutes because it's different.
Well, I didn't know that, Justin.
Last time I was there, I experienced this where it was a beautiful sunny day, and then it was like sleeting with rain 5 minutes later, and then 2 hours later, it was legitimately snowing. And then it was balmy again by afternoon. So, you know.
All 4 seasons in one day. I mean, it's, and that, I mean, you've got to understand that, you know, whiskeys and wines are really shaped by their environment they're located in. I mean, the winemakers,
yeah, absolutely, at
the terroir. Well, we talk about the provenance. And a big part of the provenance, of course, is the water. So we have there's about 5 natural springs in the hills behind where this photo was taken. And that water bubbles up through layers, it filters through layers of sandstone, limestone, granite, and it will bubble up into these natural springs. And the water will be quite rich in mineral content. So we describe it as soft water. So soft water will be rich in minerals such as magnesium and calcium. So this water will collect and it will start to convey itself into, you know, down the hillside, down a few waterfalls. It's a beautiful, actually, right behind me, the distillery owns 27 acres of beautiful Victorian gardens, but the water enters the property and it cascades down this series of waterfalls into these big sort of rock pools. And it's a bit like a Japanese garden. It's absolutely beautiful. And the water's absolutely, you know, pure. It's absolutely delicious. And, you know, there's a little safe there built into the rock. And you can, if you have the key, and I'll introduce you to the person who has the key in a minute, but, you know, to have and you did, I think, this, Jess, I mean, Dennis opened the safe, poured a little bit of Glen Grant into your glass, put the copper dog, which is an old artillery shell, into one of these rock pools, pulled out some water and nice and cool, poured it into your glass. And it's an experience unlike no other. It's
I sure
a
did.
wonderful
Yeah.
experience.
It's like
Anyway, so this is really our process water.
Pun intended.
This is our process water. So the garden really protects this water. We have the water rights, etc. And then, of course, we tap into our indigenous grain cereal of Scotland, which is barley. Now, barley is to Scotland what corn is to Kentucky. It grows twice a year. It has more enzymes than any other grain, and it also is a very rounded. It generates or delivers, a nice rounded sort of flavor profile. So you have the sweetness you get from the corn, the mellowness you may get from wheat. It will have the spice that you get from rye, but then it will also have its own unique sort of characteristics too. Those fruity, those nutty, sort of malty aromas. So we're very lucky that we have a lot of water. And at Glen Grant, we actually only process Scottish grown barley. So we buy from about 7 or 8 farmers, sometimes more, sometimes less. But the fact is that we buy Scottish barley. So we like to keep the production and the ingredients as close to us as possible.
Yeah, Robin, there was actually just kind of a question in general about like Glen Grant versus other brands. And I think this is a good moment to say that not every distillery in Scotland actually uses Scottish barley. So it is kind of a distinctive reason for us to mention that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, there's some very large companies that, a large number of distilleries, and they many of their big sort of, I would say, the big focus for a lot of these companies would be maybe their big blends, the Johnny Walkers, the Chivas Regals, and so they're buying much larger amounts of grains and barrels, etc. So they may be sourcing their barley from south of the border in England, France, Germany, other parts of Europe. I mean, I heard that, a few years ago, one company were actually sourcing Australian barley, but I think that is fascinating because the cost of getting barley all the way from Australia, but sometimes yields are not as big as they are. So, some distilleries will build in a bit of flexibility, but I think the point to make about Glen Grant is that we're still quite a small distillery. I mean, our production output is really about 10% of some of the well-known brands that you'll find ubiquitously across America. So some of our neighbors who also have the Glen in front of them, Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, many of these distilleries are much larger than ours, and they may be sourcing barley from further afield. So what we do, we process about 60 tons of malted barley. Now, back in the old days, we would do that ourselves. Nowadays, in the modern era, most of that is contracted out. Our barley is malted about 17 miles away. And as I said, it's local grown barley. This is a process here, it's called mashing. So what we do is we grind the barley through the mill, which you see is a roller mill. And then we pump in that mineral-rich water. We heat it to about 90 degrees Celsius. And this is a process of mashing, folks. And it's a process that's quite, it's synonymous across the whiskey world. You've heard of the sour mash. Well, the process of mashing is really extraction of the sugar from the grain, the soluble sugars from the malted barley. So the barley's
really quick, just gonna slightly interrupt you.
Go for it.
Really quick, one of the things we just kind of breezed over it because it's not applicable to us at Glen Grant, but we did have a question come up about peat or no peat.
So come again?
Peat or no peat with Glen Grant?
Okay, so that's a good question. So our peating, our phenol content, which we call it the phenol content in our whiskey, is 0.025 parts per million. So even though it's a tiny percentage of our malting is peat, it's mainly heated by natural gas. In the old days, we would use coal to coal would be used to dry barley in the mainland in Speyside, and before that it would be peat. But up until the 1970s, where most distilleries, in fact, Glen Grant, I think 1974, we would malt our own barley at the distillery by hand. We would use, of course, a lot more peat in that process. So Glen Grants that were distilled prior to the 1970s, and you can still find them. And we'll start to launch some of our very older stocks in years to come. But nowadays, really, we don't really use a lot of peat. Very, very small. You will be lucky to really detect, peaty notes in Glen Grant these days. But back to this, we're processing about 60 tons of malt, and then we're that sugary liquid. So what we do is the objective of the mashing is to extract the sugars to have a sugary liquid, which we call wort, which is actual fact a German brewing term. So up until this stage, it's a bit like making beer, but we do not add hops. You see, if we were to add hops to this process, then we'd be making beer, and by law, it wouldn't be Scotch whiskey. But the whole process of fermentation is really interesting. So we're pumping in that sugary liquid from the barley. That spent barley, by the way, is used as biofuels. We provide electricity for about 9,000 homes, so we don't waste the spent grain. But that sugary liquid is pumped into these wooden fermenters, and less is more and small is good. Okay, so if we were a very, very big distillery, we would probably have replaced these fermenters with stainless steel, because what you're wanting is a real consistency, and you're producing at a very, very large capacity. So you need to control it as tightly as possible. The benefit for us is because we're not a big producer, we produce in much smaller batches. So we benefit from these wooden fermenters. In fact, these fermenters, they're known as washbacks, are made from Oregon pine. So when we pump in the sugary worts, that sugary liquid, we'll add distiller's yeast. It will start to devour the sugar. And it will convert that sugar into CO2 gas and alcohol through the process of fermentation. Now, wood is it's a porous surface. It's not like stainless steel, where most of the big distilleries will use stainless steel. You'll have these little cracks and splits in the wood. So what will happen is you'll get a kind of secondary ferment, where you'll get some, yeast from the previous batch and some localized bacteria that starts to play its role and put its footprint onto the early developments of flavor. So we do this. This is the traditional way. Some people call it old school, but we like to keep some of these old sort of traditions going at Glen Grant. It's really part of our DNA, if you like. And then
I would jump in really quick and just also mention that during fermentation, where the purpose of it is to produce alcohol, right? We're fermenting to create a beer. But during that fermentation process, is that exactly as Robin was just alluding to, that there's all of these other little micro processes that are happening. In particular, the secondary flavors that are being produced by those good bacteria that sort of habitat in the Oregonian pine washbacks. And that's really where we develop quite a lot of the flavor that actually ends up in the finished spirit. So, you start with this raw ingredient, it's transformed in fermentation to have all these secondary flavors that maybe didn't exist there previously. And then when we get to distillation, we, choose for those. And Robin will explain that too.
I'm just taking a photo of the screen. So absolutely. So the next step of the process, and this is what really has won the hearts and the minds, the hands and the mouths of many consumers, is this, craft process. It's a batch process, it's a small process, stop and start. We don't press a button on a computer and the computer takes over and does everything, and you just get the deck chair out and that's job done. I mean, there's lots of craftsmanship and skill involved. And making good spirit is absolutely vital. It's a little bit like sort of fine-tuning a Rolls-Royce engine, as it were. You know, you need that experience behind you. You need to know what you're doing. You need to be able to use the equipment in the right way. And this is our still house at Glen Grant. So we have 8 stills. So that 60-ton batch is then split into 4 quarters. And so simultaneously, we're running, you know, the 4 quarters at the same time through the 4 pairs of stills. So the still closest to us is a wash still. You can see one right at the center. It's got that sort of square shoulders. That's the first distillation. The more sort of rounded still next to it on the right, that's the spirit still. So it's a double distillation process. So we're pumping in that fermented solution. We're heating it from below. In the old days, we'd use coal. Before that, we'd use peat. Now we're using natural gas. And because these stills are very tall, this is where, you know, gravity really plays a role, because this is where the engineering comes in. We're in pursuit of the absolute perfect, refined, gentle, aromatic spirit. You know, Macallan will talk a lot about its wood. You know, they have a wood master. We put a lot of emphasis on wood as well, but we want to get the spirit right. And, you know, the Glen, what comes off the still, legally, it's not yet Scotch whiskey, but that's going to be fruity. It's going to be malty. It's going to be very, very aromatic. So, but this sort of small man, you know, 5'1", the Major James Grant, he had the mind of an engineer, and he designed this distillation process to really deliver that. And he put in these water cooling purifiers. So the image on the left here is the purifier. So it sits on the head of the still. As a line arm goes into, it's an empty copper drum. And above that, it's like an inverted cone where there's it's a cold water jacket, which is pumping cold water to sort of cool down the process. So boiling vapors will come into this empty cylinder. The lighter vapors will be sucked up through the cooling element, and the heavier vapors will be pushed back down for redistillation. So it's a bit like sort of providing a little bit of extra polish on the spirit, just to make it that little bit more fruity, refined, elegant, and of course, sophisticated, because this is really a very sophisticated whiskey. Do you want to talk a little bit about the barrels, Jessamine?
Sure. Right. So when we mature the Glen Grant, we're really looking at 2 major different cask types for maturation. And you'll see this is actually a pretty solid theme across the board, just in comparison to other types of malt whiskeys out there. Typically, you'll find that most are matured in a combination of these 2. So that's definitely true for us. But I would say the primary barrel that we really use is the American ex-bourbon cask, which is made from American white oak, which has a different flavor profile often than other European species would. That's kind of where one of the distinctions as to why we would want to age in different types. So it's not just the fact that Oloroso sherry butts have a sherry seasoning that impacts flavor profile, but actually the wood flavors themselves are also different, even if there wasn't sherry in that cask. American ex-bourbon casks have a char on the inside typically. That really is good for sort of like our purification during that maturation process, but you can think of there being quite a few different reactions happening in a barrel. You have these subtractive reactions, which are things like evaporation. You have chemical reactions like oxidation, which is really important, which is kind of how flavors really develop over time in a barrel. And then you have the additive reactions, which are all the things that we normally associate with maturation of whiskey, which is like the color from the wood, the tannin from the wood, and the flavor profile that's contributed from the wood, which would be things more like caramel, vanilla, butterscotch, even things like coconut. And in certain cases, like with newer woods, American wood, you can even get things like dill. And then the sherry casks tend to give you dried fruit flavors. It's a little nuttier flavor profile, and typically also have a toastiness to them because that wood, like I mentioned, is actually a different species of oak. So typically when we talk about maturation, we did mention Dennis earlier, but he started out as a Coupar. And so a Coupar is a person who makes barrels. It's actually a kind of a lost art trade. It's a pretty intense thing for you to learn, because the cooperage apprenticeship actually takes 5 years, which is kind of crazy. If you could think about anything other than maybe med school right now that we have like as a contemporary, career that really you take 5 years just to learn before you even get to really do it on your own. Anyway, so one of the things that we really benefit from with that knowledge that he has from being a Coupar for so long is really understanding barrels and their maturation and how they're put together and really how they age over time. And we've already talked about the 12-year-old, but that house property is the combination of those two different types. Is that sufficient for you?
Yeah, no, great. Now, another important thing to know about is how we store our barrels. So I'm sure you may have seen some of the images of these Kentucky rick houses where you would have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stories in a tall building with grid windows or grilled windows, bars on the windows. There maybe the forklift truck going up and down. And quite often, a lot of these warehouses will be built of concrete, steel. The warehouses at Glen Grant, about 95 to 90, sometimes up to 100% of our barrels are kept in what we call stone dunnage warehouses. And these are old buildings, built with big, thick stone walls. So most of our warehouses are about 150 plus years old. And of course, you would have teams of stonemasons cutting the stone, building these, buildings to last, hundreds and hundreds of years. So they're known as dunnage warehouses. You'll see that that's a concrete pathway. It's sort of earth and tinder flooring, so really on the ground. The barrels are racked in what we call packing wood, which is the same wood that you would use on the ships in the old days, packing wood. And then you will have, wooden ceilings that are slated from the exterior. This one actually, this warehouse is, this is a new roof. This roof was built in the 1970s. But what will happen is, unlike America, let's take Kentucky, where 95% of bourbon is made, you'll get very hot summers and freezing winters. So you'll have this big temperature swing from summertime, the high to the lows of winter. So what's happening is the barrel's swelling right up, and the bourbon's really going into the wood and accessing those, sugars and some of these, chemical compounds. But of course, in Scotland, it's not as hot and it's not as cold. So it's these warehouses and the design of these warehouses is to keep a consistent, cool, damp, temperature pretty much all year round. So while American whiskey is aging much faster, the pace of maturation is quicker. In Scotland, it's much slower. So that tends to be why Scotch whiskey tends to be aged 10, 12, 15, 18 plus years. It takes a lot longer to mature Scotch whiskey. At Glen Grant, every drop of spirit that we produce, we bottle at the distillery. So in that way, we can really control the quality, because bottling is absolutely the final part of the process, putting it into the bottle. And we employ sort of local people, unlike many of the distilleries that will pump, they'll empty barrels and they'll pump it into a big tanker. They'll ship, they'll truck that tanker down to, the central belt in Scotland. This is all done under our supervision. So if we were a winery, it would be estate bottled. But I'm using winery as a kind of analogy that you're probably more familiar with. So it's very important for us to have this under our control. So we can absolutely, say with our hands on our hearts that, the quality of this is absolutely top notch. It's what it should be. Okay, so the great thing about Scotch whiskey, it's about the relationships, about the people you're involved in the process of making it. You know, it's a great thing to know, you know, those of us whiskey lovers, that there is a, you know, quite often a personal relationship between the people who make the whiskey, or the brand ambassadors, people like Jessamine and myself, with the consumers. It's kind of unique, the whiskey world, and particularly the Scotch whiskey world. So this is Dennis Malcolm. He's our master distiller. And Dennis, we think, is Scotland's longest serving distiller. We don't know anyone yet who has been in the making whiskey longer than Dennis. And I think I made the point earlier on that, you know, experience has got a lot to do with making a good whiskey. So Dennis started in 1961 on April the 3rd. So next year, he will have marked his sort of 60th anniversary. He was born at the distillery. You know, in the days when he was born, everybody worked at the distillery. One of the perks was you would get your own home. You know, the distillery would lease you your home, so you would have everything taken care of. And he grew up out of that generation. His father actually worked at Glen Grant, and so did his grandfather. In fact, his grandfather came back from World War I. You know, he was one of the lucky ones that, you know, that actually came back in one piece. So 1919, Dennis's grandfather starts work at Glen Grant Distillery. So he actually works directly for Major James Grant, the short sort of, the successor, if you like, the guy that put in these tall stills and purifiers. So, you know, next year, Dennis, his family involvement will have surpassed over 100 years. In fact, I think it's about 101 years. So 1919 to 20, yeah, so it's about 102 years. So that's really important. And Dennis is the master distiller. So he's really the custodian of the whiskey. It's, you know, he is, what Dennis does now, what he's doing now, is really for the next generation. So we like to think about, you know, this is our 180th anniversary. So we would like to, you know, continue what we're doing for another 180 years. So we're always thinking about the next generation when we make our whiskey. So I think that's the kind of the storytelling. I mean, it'd be great to, you know, open it up. I'm going to stop sharing now. And
yeah, if anybody has any questions, I know, you know, there's Montgomery, you said you're just kind of starting out. So we can talk a little bit about Glen Grant. Do you want to talk about the 18 first, Robin?
Yeah, I should have remembered this, but the third offering in our range, and this is our range in the US as it stands. So in years to come, we'll start to roll out older expressions, but I managed to get my hands on a bottle of the 18 in the new pack. So that's what we'll have, you know, on the shelves, on the virtual shelves, the digital shelves, you know, moving forward. But I'm just going to open this.
Yeah, go for it. One of the things that I would just mention about Glen Grant, and in context to the rest of the Scotch category, just more of a generalization, is that you can think about Scotch whiskeys, and this is malt whiskeys as well as blended Scotches. You can think of them on a spectrum from really full bodied, like the actual flavor profile of it and the way it hits your palate. Typically think of those as being almost oily like or buttery like in the way that they kind of coat your mouth when you drink them. All the way up to things that are a little bit lighter and they have a brightness to them. And that's kind of like one of the spectrums that we could talk about that has to do with Scotch. And then if you want to pivot one on its axis, and then one goes from fruity to smoky, you know, you have this combination of fruit to smoke and heavy to light. And you can almost classify every malt or whiskey that's out there somewhere on this graph. And if you wanted to put us anywhere on it, we would be on the fruity and the light end of the spectrum. We are, you know, if you put the spectrum on really crazy, smoky, vegetal, funky stuff with all these maritime notes that's almost salty, all the way to these really like kind of bright, elegant, really sort of succulent honey notes. We're more that end with the fruitiness as well. And that's because of all of the things that Robin just described as far as how we distill with the tall, slender stills, the purifiers, and then also our focus really on American oak maturation, which is not, you know, overpowering the liquid that we have distilled. So it's all about that balance of how these come together. But there's so much diversity within the Scotch category. I mean, it's really, there's so much to explore there. So my best recommendation is to just keep tasting, because that's the only way you'll start to know and learn and really understand what you like. My last point, before I get off my soapbox about this one, is that age does not equal better. You know, that doesn't mean anything, right? So we often, especially in the US, I think, are particularly focused on age statements. You know, oh, older is better, darker is better, those kinds of things that we just have sort of been ingrained to us to think, right? And that's not necessarily true for everybody, especially with all of the variants across the board with how each individual distillery may choose to produce their liquid and then choose to mature it. There's quite a lot of difference that will happen even between one 18-year-old age statement and another. And more importantly, it's about what you like, your palate, what you enjoy to drink, and also how you enjoy to drink it. And so you may really enjoy a 21-year-old Scotch because you came across it and you tasted it, but you may much more enjoy a 12 or 14 or a 16-year age statement when you want to drink something every day. So there's
just don't cut it with Pepsi Cola.
Well, I would argue
Well,
whatever you want, you can enjoy. Don't let anybody tell you how to drink your whiskey. I feel very passionately about that, because there is a lot of you know, I think there is a lot of sort of staunchness, and it classically has been in the Scotch industry of like, don't do this and don't do that, and how dare you add ice to this, and it's fine. Drink it however you want. That's the whole reason we make it for you, and we make it for you to enjoy it. And if you like it with ice, drink it with ice.
There's certainly no, you're right. There's certainly no rule book. You know, what this is, it's really a very complex. I have the 18 years old here, so it might just be worth running through this.
Well, I'm jealous because I don't.
Oh, you don't have any?
So I'll just run through the 12-year again with you.
Well, I have the 18. So the 18 is right now is the oldest expression in the range. We don't produce a lot of it. So if you get your hands on a bottle, well done. So it's always quite spotty, the availability, but as we build up our stocks, hopefully going forward, we'll have more. But this is aged in what we call refill ex-bourbon. And what's so unique and special about the 18 years old is you get that absolutely, it's not a malt molecule out of place. It's highly refined. It's you get lots of barley, butterscotch. It's a bit like standing in a barley field, you know, the day before the farmer takes in the harvest. It's absolutely delicious. You really get the DNA. You also get a little bit of that much softer, gentler, fruity notes. And then on the palate, we talk about refinement, I mean, and sophistication and elegance. You know, the 18 years old really delivers on that. So I don't know what the price of the 18 years old is. It's about $140 maybe. You know, that's quite a good price for a whiskey that's aged for that long. And I think over time, you know, the price will start as demand, as more people discover Glen Grant and demand grows. I'm sure that, you know, and as it happens with many other distilleries, they'll start to sort of put the price up, because really it's not a tap that you turn on and it just flows and flows and flows. I mean, we have about just around about 110,000 barrels in storage right now. So that's not an exhaustive amount of whiskey. That's a very finite amount of whiskey. So every drop is really precious to us. So, but you know, there's many single malts around, and during this COVID time, people are starting to discover, you know, new whiskeys, new products to add to their repertoire. So there's a great deal of discovery, exploration, and discovery going on right now. So hopefully you'll give Glen Grant a try and maybe add it to your repertoire.
And Robin, I was about to also mention, I think that the Glen Grant 12 is a great way to start to understand, especially the Speyside flavors, and really get to know how it is unique from a lot of the different regions. And Jessamine, I love how you kind of broke down the spectrum, right? Because I think that if you're just discovering Scotch whiskey, it allows you to really start to figure out, like, what are those, you know, finishing notes that you really enjoy. And then I think, you know, using an opportunity then, oh, I found something I love. Let me start working up the vertical for those aging statements and see how that evolves as you go up there.
Yeah.
I think this
Absolutely. I was just going to say that also, you know, every distillery treats their age statements differently, and you know, Glen Grant is no different in that, you know, all of our expressions they're not vertical. You know, we mature them differently. They're put together differently. Their, you know, anatomy of how they're blended is unique to that particular expression, and that's true for most. So, you know, you could start at a 12-year and be dramatically surprised by the 15. And I think that would be the case with us, because the 15 is quite different than the rest of the line. You know, and other brands will do the same. You know, their higher expressions will have dramatically different cask, you know, ratios to them. So that, you know, it might be very sherry focused or less sherry focused. So it's a really interesting way to kind of explore, you know, playing around with one brand and then tinkering to another. But, you know, don't be afraid to explore things that, you know, maybe don't even have an age statement on them. And like, there's no wrong way to go. And there's plenty of resources out there. You know, in particular, we're always resources. You can follow either Robin or I on Instagram and ask us questions forever. We'll put our handles in the chat here, but you know, there's tons of ways to learn. And I think that but I do think really tasting is so important. It's a major part of really understanding this particular category and all the different beautiful directions you can go in. So yeah. All right, well, I don't think we have any more questions. So I will wrap this up and just say thank you so much for having us on, Lee. And thank you, Robin, for presenting.
Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, well, thanks, everybody. We'll send a follow-up email with our contact information in it and some info from ReserveBar. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.